So big news. Mark Carney is going to the US, and this is a big deal because this is his second visit. So this is extremely important. And the Prime Minister of Canada is hoping to discuss things like tariffs, steel, aluminum, and of course, the auto industry. Now, this is huge, right? Because what's going on in Canada right now, if you've been paying attention, is there's some sort of an economic slowdown happening, and people want to make sure it's just a little slowdown and not a complete downhill descent into doom. Now, historically, Canada has also played hardball with the US, believe it or not. Counter tariffs, NAFTA negotiations, and technical work to diffuse the US trade associations. So the point that the government's trying to make here, and I think every Canadian needs to pay attention, is that they're putting these in the framework of talks. And these aren't actually talks. Canada has already conceded two of the biggest items Donald Trump wanted, right? He already conceded on counter tariffs, and he's already conceded on the DST, which is the digital service tax, right? So Trump got really upset that Canada was going to start charging Google's and Facebook and all these places for taxes for their services. And Trump's like, if you do that, you're in deep trouble. And of course, the Canadians were like, whoa, let's not get into deep trouble. But I think the most important point here that we all need to focus on is defending your nation is actually a balanced approach, right? It's not just about fighting the government. It's not just about trying to flex your muscles and then ultimately have nothing to win with, right? You cannot just pretend to be a superpower and then not be actually able to flex on that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to actually be tough. You actually have to be able to survive. And Canada, in its current situation, really needs the US. So although Canada's diplomacy with the US seems like it's a good thing, it's very reactionary, right? And I guess that's the way American Canada is playing it right now, that people really don't know the direction that the US is going. But it seems as though everyone knows that the US just wants a really good deal on everything and is basically suggesting they just want to open the market. Now, it doesn't sound like a horrible idea to just open the market, but at the same time, when Canada doesn't produce and finalize products such as steel and lumber and doesn't have its steel industry in the correct mannerism to be self-dependent, it puts Canada in a very difficult situation. So standing up to Washington isn't just anti-American, it's actually pro-Canadian. And it's that fine line that needs to be tight-roped. So diplomacy is a very good thing. Having great relationships with your neighbors and countries abroad is absolutely paramount in this world. But dependency is not. If Washington links tariffs to sovereignty, to security, Canada should be able to trade predictably while rebuilding their current supply. So ultimately, I kind of feel that since you are not ready for independence, Canada, since you are not ready to refuel, since you are not ready for the real world as an independent nation, that you still rely so heavily on the US for so much of your industry, that this is the time to focus on building your industry, but at the same time, making these strategic concessions that you can have peace at home while rebuilding your nation. Now, what's also even more interesting is the moving of the budget. This is actually a new move. You know, people play with the budget all the time, but this is actually a very big move. So they are now moving the budget from spring to fall. And they're saying that this will actually help and be better because it'll let people see what's going on with construction. It'll let people be able to see what's happening in the construction industry, building industry, and give better, more accurate numbers. Now, Canada has typically used spring budget for decades. Moving to fall can front load the budget and gives the chance for the government to actually set the narrative as to how it actually ends, because you really don't know. You're setting the budget so late in the year now. So it's not out of nowhere. Carney signaled this and let everyone know that this was actually happening. So it's not a bolt out of nowhere. So this fall budget allows the government to actually bury the news altogether and blur it up real good so people really can't tell what's going on. But is the transparency going to be there? Are we going to actually label expenses as investments? And this is the trick, right? The government can basically just say, we're going to be investing in these things, and it ends up that these are just expenses, but because it's so back heavy now, the budget, they're able to hide things and play with things a little bit. So it's very dangerous for people to really understand what's going on here. This is a pretty big deal, moving the budget. Like, there should be a major discussion in the House of Commons, and it needs to be front and center. And you have to keep in mind that when this fall budget gets put out there and it's able to be discussed, Parliament comes to an end. So there is less time to really negotiate, less time to really plan these things out. So this really gives the current government a lot of room to spin this thing any way they want. So it's quite dangerous from that perspective. So although it does give time for the federal government to understand what the provinces are doing and somewhat align their budgets accordingly, it also gives really good narrative control to the prime minister and gives him the ability to kind of just push the narrative any direction he wants. And it gives him the idea and it gives him the ability to push the narrative basically any way he wants. So I'm all for this idea. I think it's actually makes sense that you actually understand what the provinces are doing and then build your budget accordingly. But the fact that the parliament is set up the way it is gives very little time to negotiate, very little time to understand the budget. And if politicians are the way politicians are, and you and I both know that sometimes there's more talking than due diligence, this puts all of the taxpayers in a very sticky situation, because really, if you don't have enough time to review these documents, who in the end is going to suffer? The entire economy is going into defense and military. This is something that every Canadian needs to take advantage on. Now, I'm not offering any stock advice. I'm not giving you any advice whatsoever to what to do with your money. But it has to be noted that Mark Carney and the Liberals are going head on into investments in building Canada. Investments into military, investments into refinement, anything to do with construction, Canada's going all in. So if there was ever a time to invest in construction, to invest in your nation with hard cash, this is the time. Carney is signaling billions for military modernization and infrastructure nation building. This is just what he's promised to do. On top of that, there's boosts for construction, metals, alloys, you name it. There is a huge push from the federal government to make sure that Canada begins investing in itself. Defense spending at NATO, we all heard that Canada is going to increase its budget. This is a long overdue thing in Canada, right? Everyone has to know that Canada, in terms of its military, has lagged far behind most nations. NATO was complaining about Canada. So everyone was basically complaining about Canada's investment in NATO. So for sure, government spending in this field is going to be massive. Government spending in actual infrastructure is going to be massive. If you've looked outside and you see all the construction going on, if you hear about projects to make underground trains, if you heard about projects to make a high-speed rail, Canada is investing tons of money into its infrastructure. But all these things need to be strategic. This cannot be a blank check. This cannot be just, hey, Canada, do whatever you want to make Canada great. There needs to be checks and balances. So investment in Canada, of course, but with accountability. We can no longer be spending as if we have an endless supply of money. Inflation is a concern. Taxes are a concern. And Canadians are already suffering with the cost of living right now. It is already high enough for every metric. Canadians are super annoyed. Coffee is going up in price. Everything's going up in price. So the government needs to figure out ways that it can invest money and increase the living and increase. Canada needs to figure out how it can do all these things. Canada needs to figure out how it can make all these investments into the infrastructure, but at the same time, raising the quality of life for every single Canadian. It's not just about reduced tax. It's not just always rebates. I'm fed up with rebates. Let's just see less taxes. There's enough taxes in the world in Canada. Everything in the world we have is being taxed. So instead of just taxes and taxes and taxes, if you really want to make a difference for the average Canadian, reduce the taxes. You've collected enough, and I believe there's plenty of room in the budget to reduce the spending and give Canadians the break they so undoubtedly deserve. And what you really need to watch out for, Trump and Carney's relationship is at an all-time low. Now, there was a lot of speculation in the beginning that Trump and Carney were best friends, that Carney worked at Brookfield, and therefore Trump has Brookfield, and they're best buds. What we can judge, what we can see based on the optics and based on what's happening right now is that this relationship is really at an all-time low. Trump most recently, again, mentioned that Canada should be a 51 state. So after Carney asked multiple times for this to stop happening, it continues to happen. So already have the aggression being made by Donald Trump. Trump is still framing Canada as taking advantage and not doing its part to balance out the trade. And of course, Prime Minister Mark Carney is walking a very fine line. Love him or hate him, the unfortunate reality is, in order to protect Canada's sovereignty, he has to walk this fine line where he gives some concessions to the Americans and then makes major requests at the same time that may seem unfair to the Americans, but potentially is the only way for Canadians to actually survive. Now, what's really challenging, of course, is that Trump appeals to a lot of the people in Canada, right? The challenge, of course, is that this 51 state idea appeals to many Canadians. Now, it might not appeal to you, but people in the Rust Belt, they actually feel that this isn't such a horrible idea. They are ready to go. They're ready to switch ship. They've already felt they were American this entire time. So this isn't a major move for a lot of them. So Canada has to defend its sovereignty, right? That's kind of the rule of a nation. Like you have to protect yourself, even though you may or may not disagree. Like it's actually hard to tell what is going on in Canada sometimes. You have this very excited premier in Ontario that's ready to defend Canada and Ontario at any cost. And you have a president in the United States ready to take Canada at any cost at the exact same time. And the people are drawn right down the middle. There are some people, as I said, super excited to switch teams. And it makes sense on certain metrics. You'll have American dollars. You have access to the largest economy. You have access to the incredible amount of wealth and investment and open markets. So there's a lot of good reasons to do it. But at the same time, comes with a whole bunch of other reasons that people are very worried about. Healthcare. People are worried about the actual civil rights. People are actually worried about their individual freedoms. People are worried about the actual business. How is it going to be to deal with all these other people? So it's really a complicated situation. And of course, let's not throw out the involvement with. So Canada has to defend its sovereignty. There's no question about it. As a nation, that is its mandate. It has to protect itself. It has to protect itself and its workers and its population with dignity. That is the bare minimum of any nation. But this also comes with the potential for short-term pain, because if you do not wish to battle Canada, then you need to exert some sort of pressure to try and take it if that is your actual goal. So if Donald Trump's actual goal is to take Canada, then he will exert as much pressure as he sees fit to achieve that goal. And the problem with exerting that sort of pressure is that Canadian citizens are going to feel that pain more than anybody else. Our livelihoods, our jobs, our food costs, we will feel the direct blunt of these punches because this is our industry. This is where we work. And of course, we can't be seen as supplicants to Washington. That wouldn't make any sense for any nation to just be seen as worshiping Washington and worshiping the state. It doesn't work this way. Either we are an independent nation or we're not. So the idea here is that we are trading with the nations, trading with the world, but we cannot be seen as beggars. So nation building is great, of course. So nation building is great. Working on a refinement is great. Working on oil is great. Working on gas is great. Working on anything to improve the livelihood of Canadians is absolutely important. You can't do it today. Then the best option, of course, and I believe this is what the government is doing, is finding that happy medium where all parties are happy. Maybe Canada takes some concessions more so than others, right? They've already given up on the digital tax. They've already given up on the counter tariffs. So they've already given up so much. So where is that line where, okay, Canada can now have a peace of mind, its biggest trade partner is no longer in question, and it can just live its life, do its thing, and resume life as normal? Because once there is stability in the economy, once Canadians are certain that life will resume, then maybe the economy can bounce back to normal. So one more thing I wanted to mention. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, writes a huge letter to Mark Carney. And in this scathing letter, he actually says, no more losing. And basically, he's telling the Prime Minister that, look, you promised that you will have your elbows up. You promised wins for Canada, and you've delivered nothing. You've basically given everything the Americans want. What gives? What gives? And in response to a lot of these things, and Trump has actually responded negatively to what Canada's actually done. Putting new tariffs on lumber, putting new tariffs on furniture, a sign that talks are actually going in the completely wrong direction. And Poilievre says in his letter, and I quote, "U.S. tariffs on Canada are twice as high as when you were elected, saying that you would get rid of them. You promised this up, but then caved on dollar-for-dollar counter tariffs, digital service tax, and more while winning nothing in return for Canada. No more losing. It is time for you to deliver the promised wins," he said, while demanding, of course, that Carney and Trump get it all together. While he actually says that you need to lift the tariffs on lumber and steel, he continues to say you need to get rid of the Buy American rules that discriminate against Canadian builders. And he concludes with this very strong statement that if you return with just photo ops and broken promises, you have failed our workers and our country. And let's be honest, he's absolutely right, of course, right? Like, who's debating what Pierre is saying? Of course, this is the ideal scenario that Canada says, get rid of all these tariffs, get rid of all these things, give us a deal that's actually good for Canadians. The problem, of course, is Canada, in my humble opinion, is just so weak. Canada doesn't have the ability to flex many, if any, muscles at all, and it has to succumb to what America wants. The challenge, of course, is coming out, being intelligent enough, being savvy enough to negotiate a deal that will actually benefit Canada. There has to be some loophole. There has to be some nugget of information, some leverage Canada has in certain areas. So if Canada can leverage itself properly to promise the Americans a great deal on trade, that'll be great. Because as long as you hear Donald Trump saying that Canada's taking advantage of us, that Canada's got a great deal and we're being laughed at and we're being taken advantage of, if that's the sentiment that Donald Trump has, that sentiment has to change. Because if there's any indication of the way the American government is currently working, the sentiment is whatever Donald Trump feels is the policy. And therefore, perhaps it's not actually merely just words on paper, but actual sentiments and feelings that need to be considered.